Power Podcast.
What's going on, you guys? Long time, I know. Taking me a while to do. It's just been busy with work and everything else. Hope everybody is doing well. I know this thing has been crazy. Yeah, I really hope everybody's doing well. This whole COVID-19 thing has been really hard on some people, and hopefully you're not one of those that are affected that I know. And for those that are affected, I am deeply sorry, and I will definitely be praying for you and your family's welfare during this time. With that all said, I had a lot of private messages regarding my post about greatness doesn't transcend time. And I think some people are getting the signals crossed on what I'm saying. I am not saying, and I just want to put this clear out there right now. I am not saying that human beings are better today, or like when they come out of the womb, they're a higher breed of human than those of the past. I'm not saying that, and the science doesn't really back that. What I am saying is there are aspects of what people are born into that are significantly better. And those things do help have a compound interest effect on a human being's development. So, for example, technology, training equipment. At a very much earlier age, young men are getting these abilities through these machines at a much earlier rate than their predecessors. And like anything in human development, the earlier you do it, the quicker your success rate will start to happen, because again, you have that compound interest. You have shoe technology, you have all sorts of nutrition that's better. I can remember with my son, when me and Josette had Marcus, I remember the doctor saying, it's a shame they didn't have this type of infant formula back in our time, because they found that this formula in particular was much better for brain development and helping the brain, giving the brain basically nutrients. They didn't have that, and they found that there is some value in that. So people who may be coming on and asking me questions about these things, these things are at the least of really the conversation. To me, when I say greatness doesn't transcend time, I am simply stating that it is quite ridiculous for anybody to think that a Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, a Michael Jordan even, comes into this era and has the same ability and same value. There would definitely take some time to readjust. Now, a guy like Michael Jordan, would he be one of the better players in the NBA if he came out today? I think so, sure. Would, other guys, sure. But for example, I'll give you a prime example of what I'm talking about. Magic Johnson's probably not playing point guard in this era. He's probably going to play power forward. And I don't know how anybody can dispute that. It's not that he can't play point guard. It's just that the era in which he played, point guards were not that extreme in speed, fluidity, and change of tempo. It just weren't. It's not to say that there were no point guards during that time. Sure there were. But the matchups every night weren't as taxing athletically. For example, John Wall is just one of many point guards that have this ability in this era. Very few positions evolved at a higher rate than point guard. Point guard is an extreme position now. Thanks to Derrick Rose, Russell Westbrook. All these guys came in and changed the dynamic of point guard play and made it much more athletically demanding. It's not to say that there's no such thing as there's no such thing as every point guard in the NBA today is uber athletic. No, but a good portion of them are. Even guys that we don't consider to be that great. De'Aaron Fox. De'Aaron Fox is a great point guard, but we don't consider him top 10 yet. He's arguably the quickest guard in the game right now. Lonzo Ball is really probably the closest in being a athletic matchup for Magic, and even Lonzo has a little bit more bounce in his play than Magic does. And as a matter of fact, many people, which I don't consider, again, we talked about this during the draft when Lonzo was drafted, but many people actually thought Lonzo Ball was going to be a Jason Kidd type player, which I never understood how people thought that. But needless to say, there is some, and if you remember Jason Kidd, he might not have had the bounce, but he certainly had the end-to-end speed, and he was a very fast guard. I don't know how much of that would affect Magic Johnson. Now, listen, that's not to say that Magic Johnson would not come in the NBA and do great things. Sure he would. But would he come in and be the best point guard in the NBA like he was for the large part of his career? No. And, I think this is, look, maybe this is just me, but I think there's a small segment of the older basketball groups, and I get why it happens. And I want to tell those older fans and older people in the NBA community that, look, I understand, and you have my respects, but I do think that sometimes we put on the shelf logic and reasoning because we don't like to feel that our childhood heroes are being respected, and we don't like the feeling that our era is being disrespected. Listen, there is nothing wrong with the era in which basketball was played, depending on what era you come from. It doesn't really matter. These guys were the best players of that era. And I think genius gets recognized, but will genius transcend throughout time and have the same exact value? I mean, no, it just doesn't. I mean, take basketball out of the equation. Let's talk about Alexander the Great, right? I mean, here's a guy that conquered the known world by the time he was 23. Let's talk about Genghis Khan, or Genghis Khan, as I think his name really is translated into. These guys were military geniuses. Sure, absolutely. But would that genius transcend all the way into today's world? Like, could Alexander the Great conquer the whole known world now? Like, probably not. Could Khan? Probably not. It's not to say that those guys aren't geniuses, but as we know through tons of research, that when you are born does greatly affect you. It just does. It's science at this point. It's not even up for the debate, really. The metrics are pretty clear. When you are born does have an effect on your success or failure rates as a human being. It just does. And sometime you might have been one of the best ever, and another time you're just a peasant. Like, it's just how it's going to be because of how things are when you come into them as a human being. And I think the young generation, the ESPN metric guys, I think they do a lot to discredit the older generation, and I don't agree with that. And I think they go about it the wrong way. So again, I completely understand the fighting that goes on within the basketball circles. But I can tell you this, as a father of the new generation and as a son of the older generation, I can tell you that I don't see it that way. I think that there are guys in the past that don't get enough credit. I think there are guys in the past who, the new generation doesn't respect at all. But I also think there's guys in the past that the older generation gets a little too overzealous about. And, it's always funny to me, people who want to argue these things that I don't even understand why we're arguing, because really to me it's pretty clear. I mean, for example, Madam C.J. Walker. If anybody's seen the Netflix special, Madam C.J. Walker was a monster, beast of that time. The question comes into play, could Madam C.J. Walker do something in this era? We don't know. The cards, even though they were more heavily slanted against her, the cards that she would be where she is in the Netflix special, we just don't know. There's so many variables at play. I mean, certainly women's rights are far, far greater. The access to education and so many other things are together. But do I think she could put a hairline together? Maybe. maybe the hairline would be something that she wouldn't even be involved in, depending on her life and how she grew up. So like, we don't know that. Like, there's so many. That's what I'm saying. There's so many things that come into play when we talk about this. If Madam C.J. Walker never, becomes friends with the young lady who she got some of her ingredients to make the hair from, Madam C.J. Walker's whole life is altered and it's way different. So I think from that standpoint, I think we need to acknowledge that if you can point to parts in people's lives where they were changed, then if those events never happen, do those people, because they have greatness per se, do those events still happen? I don't think they do. It's like I tell people Wilt Chamberlain can come in today's NBA. Bill Russell could. Michael Jordan could. A lot of guys could, right? Well, let me rephrase this. I'm not going to say a lot of guys, but a good portion of the older generation. Anybody that was in the NBA, I don't know, 90 to about 1970, right? A lot of those guys would be able to come in. Now, the older your era is, the less and less your ability to maybe contribute on the next level of basketball, it would definitely change. So I give a ton of respect to guys that could come in from the 1960s and be a part of the NBA's basketball today. Like, to me, if put it like this, if I told you that a computer from 1971, you could go on today and do everything that you want to do, would you tell me that's amazing? Sure you would. You would say that's amazing. I can go on this computer from 1971 and do online shopping, order things from the internet, do all these things. If I told you that, you would be like, oh my God, that's amazing. So when people say Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain could play in today's NBA, to me, that is basically the comparison, the correlation between those two. Is that we're basically saying these players who are so far removed from the technology and the culture and everything else that is that has happened, transpired in NBA history, we're saying these guys could come out and still perform. That is the ultimate respect. And I think the older generation doesn't like that. I think they want us to say, well, Wilt comes in and he's averaging 50 points a game in today's NBA. Like, come on, man. That's you want your cake, you want your slice of cake, and you want the whole cake too. Like, come on. We're giving you the olive branch, and more importantly, we're acknowledging the greatness of this player from this era. And the fact that we're saying that Bill Russell could start or Wilt Chamberlain could start, I don't know what greater level of respect a researcher, a historian can have. Like, to me, it's insane. It's insanity. Like, we're literally saying that a relic, which is what you are if you played in the NBA in the late 60s, 1970s. That's no disrespect. You're from a different time that concentrated on different basketball skills. I mean, case in point, right? You will see and look, again, I want to give the criticism both ways, because the younger generation, the ESPN metric crowd, they disrespect older basketball too, because they're concentrated on the new values and they think that the new values mean more than the old values. So, like, for example, in most modern NBA rankings, all-time rankings, you'll see that post-play gets minimized. Why does post-play get minimized? Post-play gets minimized because in today's NBA, post-play is minimized. Passing point guards get minimized by NBA guys. Now, they'll grant, which is always weird to me, they'll grant that to Steve Nash because of Steve Nash's shooting ability. Because why? Because the three-point shot in this era is so valued. They will deny a guy like John Stockton, for example. They'll say, well, John Stockton's value isn't as great because he wasn't as great of a three-point shooter as Steve Nash. We have these things that happen, and we totally disavow them, the younger generation. So that's what I'm saying. Like, I'm not over here saying that the older generation is the only people that have this issue. The new generation does too, because they go into, it's like Bill Simmons, right? Bill Simmons wrote that book about basketball, and he said he wrote it to prove that Bill Russell was the greatest NBA basketball player of all time. Well, guess what? He already lost. Because if you go into a project with the predetermined idea of, yo, this guy is the best, well, then you're going to, you've already killed your research. You've already disapproved your own self, because you're not writing it from a place to find out where the history goes. You're writing it from a place that, how can I prove? So that's the difference here. That's where the problems with these current ESPN researcher guys and basketball reference guys and all these people out here who do all this stuff, they murky the waters because they talk about players that they've never seen play. They can't tell you, like, for example, George Gervin. I think George Gervin in this era would be ridiculous. Okay? I mean, you're kidding me? You can't touch George Gervin? I think it's gonna be problematic. But what a modern NBA researcher does is, well, I'm just gonna look at win shares and PER. And win shares is really, and I don't know, on a lot of Bleacher Reports, they use just win shares. They don't even look at the totality of a basketball ability. They just look at win shares. That's, to me, always the most amazing thing about today's era is, yes, in the old era, we have a problem because we have guys that feel that are offended when you suggest that a player's value doesn't transmit at the same value that it was in 1965, which doesn't make any sense to me, but that's some of the logic is at. And it also pisses off the new generation when they see these type of blatant admonishments of current research, which, yeah, some of the criticism is true and some of the criticism is absolutely fair. Absolutely. But I really do a good job, I think, of trying to figure out a player's value because I don't look at statistics at first. I look at the whatever film I can find of them. And then I look at what people said about them during the time that they played. And then I look at what was said about them after they stopped playing. And then I look at the stats because you got to get the whole umbrella of a player's value. Okay? So when I make these statements that when I say that, you know, greatness doesn't transcend time, what I'm saying is we can acknowledge your genius of that era. There's not a person alive that's going to sit there and say that Bob Cousy, George Mikan, for example, weren't the best players of their era. Like, everybody will acknowledge that. What only real research and scholarly, researching will tell you is Bob Cousy and George Mikan's greatness had a lot of things applied to it that helped the mirage of the idea of the greatness. Like, for example, Mikan had his little, it wasn't even something that he created. It was outside things that happened that really helped him keep his titles as the best big man in basketball. I mean, Bob Curlin goes to the NIBL. Clyde Lovellette is drafted by his team. Larry Faust, who was one of the better centers of that era, that's really the only competition that Mikan has. And then you have the scandal with Chuck Darling. Chuck Darling goes to the NIBL. Jim Spirley from the Kentucky Wildcats, the best big man in basketball at that time, isn't able to go into the NBA. So a lot of things happened that assisted George Mikan as never really being challenged. As far as Bob Cousy played years with the Boston Celtics. They didn't win a title till Bill Russell showed up. But Bob Cousy, because he's on that team, people will ignore, okay, he didn't win a title till Bob Cousy came along. And they'll ignore that, okay, he also had Bill Sharman. He also had all these other Hall of Fame players play with him. And then we say, oh, okay, I get it now. And Bill Russell, truth be told, it wasn't like he didn't have any. It's not when Boston didn't have any pieces. They had Easy Ed McCauley, and they still couldn't get the title. They didn't get the title till they got Bill Russell. So, how great was Bob Cousy? How great was George Mikan? When you start putting in all these things, and I'm talking about great from an all-time perspective. Now, we're not going to sit there and argue that Bob Cousy's not the best of his era. We're not going to sit here and say that George Mikan wasn't the best of his era. But when we start taking the overall picture, best point guards of all time, best centers of all time, we then have to take into account all those things I said. Because all those things I said all have a contributed factor to where they place in the all-time list. Because you got to know a player's backstory in order to accurately capture their value. I mean, that's just what it is. I mean, for example, Steve Nash. As great as Steve Nash is, we also have to take a look at these other variables that play a part in Steve Nash's overall ranking, which is, did he win? Which is, what was his career like? Why did he not do anything until he turned 30? Why, and by doing anything, I mean like he didn't hit an MVP level until he was almost 30 years old. And it just happens to coincide with Mike D'Antonio, who has always done well historically, bringing up the values of point guards that played with him. You got to take in all these factors, and you have to then look at it and say, okay, how great is Steve Nash? I mean, he never did what Jason Kidd did. He never took the New Jersey Nets to the NBA Finals, not once, but twice. He never won a title with Dirk Nowitzki. He had Dirk Nowitzki for much of his career, didn't win a title. Jason Kidd did at 40 years old. You have to take a look at these things, and you have to say, okay, this is what it is. And researchers fall usually for two problems. They usually fall with the error problem because they can't really accurately capture the errors right. And they usually fall into the other trap, which is recency biased. While Steve Nash probably isn't the best point guard of his generation, he gets that view because of the MVPs. So researchers see the MVPs and they ignore everything else that transpired in the career because, well, he got 2 MVPs. Why would the NBA give him 2 MVPs if he wasn't the best player, period? And we know also from the stats of that time that the 2 MVPs of Steve Nash were highly contested, that they weren't this it wasn't like there wasn't any challengers in those years. I think Steve Nash's 1 MVP is probably on the money, and the second one is highly suspicious. And I think anybody who takes a look at the people who he went against, I think most people are going to be like, yeah, I don't understand that. Let's not play this game like Steve Nash isn't that way. Like, people don't like when I talked about Moses Malone, for example. When I talked about Moses Malone being the best player in that 5-year stretch in the NBA, people wanted to talk about Kareem. Well, then I talked about the fact that Moses destroyed Kareem, and then people say, well, Kareem is old. Well, look, you got to make up your mind here. Because when Kareem played Wilt, I didn't get that for Wilt. No one said, oh, well, Wilt was old. That's why Kareem was getting him. No one said that. They said, oh, look, see, Wilt ain't the best. Kareem came in and destroyed him. All right. So if you can apply that logic with Wilt Chamberlain because you don't like Wilt, which many researchers don't, then I can't apply the same logic with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar? Wait a minute. If there's one thing researchers need to do is they need to be even and remain constant. So if that's your criticisms of one player, you have to carry that same criticism to the other player. If you're going to sit here and you're going to tell me Kareem is this, and you're going to ignore that 5-year window when Moses Malone was whooping his ass, Well, you can't tell me that. Then why are you holding it against Wilt Chamberlain then? I mean, you got to make up your mind here. So again, I get why everybody has their opinions. I just think that this whole discussion is a really difficult discussion to have because there's so many things that come into play. Look, let me wrap it with the bow at the end of this. If you believe that greatness transcends any time, then what you are arguably saying is, and again, I'm not picking on this guy. I'm using him because he is looked at as a greatness. Like, we recognize his genius during his time. But if greatness transcends time, then that means I can take John Wooden, transplant him into college basketball today, and he should be out there winning 10 straight titles. That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen because John Wooden, because of when he was born, didn't have certain things he had to deal with. He didn't have to deal with the NBA's early entry. He didn't have to deal with recruiting as on the level that he did when he was in the 70s. I mean, let's keep it real. The power of UCLA during the Sam Gilbert era wasn't that Sam Gilbert coached UCLA. No, John Wooden coached UCLA. But what Sam Gilbert allowed them to do is it allowed them to be one of the first colleges that had national recruiting, which was huge on the college basketball landscape in the 60s. To get a Kareem Abdul-Jabbar from New York and a Lucius Allen from Kansas City and a Bill Walton from Texas, that's huge. If you look at the earlier parts of UCLA's winning, many of their players are based in the California area. It really wasn't that unusual. When the 70s, when the late 60s start to happen, you start to see players from across the nation coming to UCLA. And that's what made it an unusual situation. That's what made it like, wait a minute, how are you plucking all these guys? And that's when people started putting the names together. And that's why people have what they have. Now, again, we recognize John Wooden for dominating his era, and we all say, yo, he's a genius. We all say it. But John Wooden ain't coming back and winning 10 straight titles. It's just not happening. It's just not. That's where we have this fallout of logic here. Because if you're telling me that greatness transcends time, then you're telling me that the value of a person is going to be the same in any era. And that's just not true. That's just not true. Let me end it with this, and I'll give it a modern skill that's outside of basketball. When I was a young man, I taught myself HTML, PHP, JavaScript. I taught myself all these self-coding techniques, right? And I can go out and I can code, right? Now, I learned this when I was 16, 17 years old. Coding, you used to be able to go make some really good money on coding. You could make, back in the day, a really nice bit of money. Now, coding doesn't make you $30,000. And there's a reason for that. But when I was a kid, when I was 18 years old, it was up here. And everybody else was down here in terms of knowing the knowledge of coding. Now what's happened is everybody's come up. So the more people there is, the less value something is. So no, my coding value changes drastically in this era than it was when I was a young man in the early 90s. Look, if that don't tell you that things aren't the same, I don't know what will. But I think that this is critical to understanding the world that we live in. It's not that we have a hard time understanding greatness. It's just that we have a hard time admitting that greatness is fluid. And greatness is very much an outside variable that often we can't control. I'll talk to you guys later. Peace.